Hello, children, and welcome to Chapter 27, The 1950s, or the era in which your grandparents may have been born. Man, really? That's kind of scary. Okay, so, hi, how's it going? Hope all is well. Let's get into this chapter. Now, the 1950s are an interesting time period in American history. Uh, we're kind of in between big major wars, we're in between big major events, and we're going to spend a couple of years kind of focusing on ourselves for a while also being concerned about the rest of the world. A lot of people call this the greatest time period in America. I'm not so sure that's entirely true, but if you were to travel back in time and you were going to be I don't know, 25-year-old male, the 1950s is not a bad time to start your life in that regard. So let's talk about what goes on. We're going to be looking at the significance of the Federal Highway Act, otherwise known as the Interstate Highway System, which is one of my favorite things about America, talking about that. We're going to look at the growing Cold War and be going through that in some detail. We're going to look at the change that 1950s American society goes through, specifically in regards to women, and then we're going to be looking at the origins of the civil rights movement in the case of Brown versus the Board of Education of Topeka, Kansas. Might be the most important Supreme Court case of the entire 1900s, and easily one of the most tested about Supreme Court cases. So we're going to spend a lot of time looking at that as well. So let's dive into the 1950s. The poster child for the 1950s is going to be this dude here. His name is Dwight David Eisenhower, otherwise known as the President of the United States at this time period. Eisenhower is a very middle of the road candidate. He's not very divisive. In fact, both the Republican and Democratic parties wanted him to be their candidate in the election. So that's kind of like what this guy is about. He is an ideal candidate from either party. To put it bluntly, he comforted people. He put things in common terms and almost seemed like a grandfather figure. People really liked him. He practices something called dynamic conservatism, which meant that he took a centrist approach to most problems. He wasn't super conservative, he wasn't super liberal, he basically was focused on what would be the most important for the country. He wanted to cut taxes, contain inflation, and govern efficiently, all while keeping as many New Deal programs as possible. He raised the minimum wage and provided federally funded housing for low income families. So again, he does some things that don't sound super conservative, and he does some things that don't sound super liberal. Right down the middle, does what's best for the country, arguably a very, very good president for the United States. One of the biggest and most lasting legacies of the Eisenhower presidency is going to be the Federal Highway Act of 1956. So basically, Eisenhower is a military general, right? He was a general during World War II, and he realized that the United States actually has a pretty drastic problem. Should there be a major war or a major attack, let's just say on the West Coast, we'd have a very difficult time moving our supplies across the country. The United States is about 3,000 miles wide. There aren't a lot of roads, and it would be very difficult to move troops or to move supplies from one side of the country to the other should there be an imminent attack. Um, Eisenhower also learns from being in Germany, he learns about this thing called the Autobahn, which is going to be a freeway, essentially, in Germany. And he realizes, that would be a really good thing to have in the United States, a system of freeways, that way you could easily get from one side of the country to the other. It also makes sense when it comes to you want to promote trade. It makes it a lot easier to move goods across the country when there are freeways. Using side roads or unpaved roads is not really ideal for transporting goods or people. So if we build a system of freeways, that's going to make it a lot easier to move all of these goods. Eisenhower is going to recommend an infrastructure project that would cost as much as fighting a war. It's a pretty expensive project. He asked Congress for $40 billion, which is more than half of the federal budget that year, because his plan is to build 41,000 miles of paved freeways. This is the largest public works project in U.S. history and perhaps even in world history. How's the government going to pay for this? It's going to be paid for by new gasoline taxes, which are going to pay for about 90% of this project. If you ask me, this is actually more impressive than the Great Wall of China. I have been to the Great Wall of China, and it's a pretty big wall, but it's actually smaller than I was expecting. I know it's super old and everything, but it was like I went there and I was all, well, okay, that's impressive, but the 5 freeway is significantly more impressive, significantly bigger, significantly more like stronger, able to hold more weight. It's not as old, but it's like an order of magnitude a bigger deal than the Great Wall of China. I'm sorry for all of those of you in China listening to this. Um, Hi, by the way. But the 5 freeway to me is more impressive, and that's just a part of the Federal Highway Act or the Interstate Highway System. Just something to think about. This system was planned, like every road that was built for the Interstate Highway Act is actually planned before the first one is even actually built. The entire system is planned out, and you can see it here in this map in the bottom right, what the plan was going to look like. Um, the government's also going to practice something known as eminent domain. So what happens if your land is in the way of this project? Let's just say you own a big chunk of land in southwestern Utah, and the government wants to build the 15 freeway going all the way up through there. What happens? Well, there's a little thing in the Constitution that says that the government can legally take your land so long as it's going to be used for a public good. Does that mean they could take your land and build a Walmart? No. But what that does mean is that the US government can take your land and build a freeway or build a public park, or maybe your land is actually built on a historical area. They could take that land from you and make it a historical park or something like that. Um, you are going to be compensated for the land that you lose, usually way more than the value of the land that you own. But the government does have the right to take property away from you so long as it's used for the public. Again, can they take away your land and give it to Walmart and have them build a Walmart there? No, doesn't work that way. But for the public good, yes, they can. So there's a difference. It this I'm sorry, I'm kind of geeking out about this. I'm probably giving you more details than you need, but I'm super impressed that we did this. So I think it's awesome. It required enough concrete to build a sidewalk that would go all the way to the moon. This project took 35 years to construct to its completion, and in fact it cost over $115 billion, dollars, a little bit more than the 40 billion dollars as originally estimated. But there's actually something really interesting about this um, idea, this creation of a freeway system. We've talked before about how Americans are addicted to cars. Well, this addiction is going to become like a serious problem almost with the creation of the Federal Highway Act. This is going to make America much smaller and more homogeneous. Suddenly, communities aren't as far away from each other because you can just hop on a freeway and drive for an hour and be someplace completely different. It's a lot more feasible to do than to get on a horse and ride for 3 or 4 days to go the same distance, or to find a train and hope you're going there at the right time to be on that train, going in and stopping in that one space. It's much easier to take a freeway to get places. You guys probably take a freeway all the time. This idea, taken with the purchasing power of the GI Bill, led more Americans to buy cars and basically live in their cars and travel throughout this country. Suddenly, new suburban areas are going to open up outside of cities. You guys, as I am recording this, I am working at Bonita High School in Laverne. Um, you guys are living in a suburb outside of a major city of Los Angeles. So basically, you guys are a product of the Federal Highway Act. Laverne is going to be, I mean, it's older than the Federal Highway Act, but it's going to be significantly populated by people that are working 30 miles away in Los Angeles, but they're able to get there because of a freeway that was part of the interstate highway system. That's how this works. And that's really going to change what America looks like. Suddenly, we don't need to live in major cities anymore. We can live in areas outside of a city called a suburb. This is also going to lead to the growth of franchises and food chains such as McDonald's. So it provided a common food so you knew what you were getting at a common restaurant no matter where you were in the country. And Americans actually really like that. So um, McDonald's is actually, this is actually kind of where McDonald's becomes so popular, is they actually build a majority of their franchises right off of the exits from the interstate highway. That's how it works. Um, this is also going to boost shipping and make transportation easier across the country. Again, I'm geeking out about this. Let's move on. Oh wait, no, I want to say one more thing. I found this comment online and it really made me think. What was the most significant and craziest invention? This commenter wrote this. Roads. I can get in my car right now and go pretty much anywhere. There is an unbroken route from where my car is parked to virtually every location on this continent. Or, put another way, if you live in North America, there is a high probability that my driveway is connected to yours, no matter who you are and no matter where you are in North America. And what's even crazier about that, you go back in time to the year 1900, almost none of those roads exist. In the last 100, and at the time of this recording, last 116 years, really in the last 75 years, most of those roads were made. It's something to think about. That's pretty mind-blowing to me. Okay, I am done geeking out about infrastructure projects. Let's jump back into the Cold War. Another reason why the 1950s are a pretty good time to live in is that we call this a thaw in the Cold War. The Cold War is still going on. We're still concerned about the actions of the Soviet Union, and we're still concerned about the spread of communism. Containment is still a thing. We're still concerned about losing land and losing um, countries, I should say, to communism. But there's gonna be kind of a weird stoppage point in the story here because in 1953 Joseph Stalin dies, and Russia's going to go through a little bit of a power struggle during this time period, and they're going to be kind of concerned with themselves, which means we are allowed to not focus so hard on Russia. So we have a little bit of a thawing in the Cold War. It's still a huge major concern, don't get me wrong. We're still going to continue a huge arms buildup, but we're not really going to have any direct confrontation with the Soviet Union during this time period. Eisenhower is going to continue Truman's containment policy with some changes. These changes are brought about by John Foster Dulles, the Secretary of State, and don't let his last name throw you. He's actually quite interesting. He argues, no, that joke is not written in my notes, but it probably should be. He argues that America should not focus on containing communism, but work on liberating people who are struggling under Soviet regimes. To do this, the United States would use this process called brinksmanship, which meant that they would push the Soviet Union to the brink of nuclear war until they backed down. So the logic basically being that the Soviet Union is going through a power struggle, so we're going to kind of push the envelope a little bit and basically tell the Soviet Union we are willing to go to a nuclear war if we have to stop their spreading. And really, this is actually a time period when the Soviet Union isn't really growing, so this process basically works. And it's not really an idle threat. There's a really good chance that we might have, if something came up, we might have actually pushed the Soviet Union to the brink of nuclear war. We thought we were stronger than they were, so it makes sense to just basically keep pushing them. It's almost like thinking of like two boxers before a boxing match, and like they're taking that photo, and they get like all up in each other's faces, like just go ahead, daring the other person to throw the first punch to show they're more of a man. That's kind of what the 1950s looks like. Neither side's really going to fight. In fact, there really isn't any fighting in the 1950s, but we're going to give each other the impression that we will. So again, we call it a thaw in the Cold War, but it doesn't mean that we're not thinking about it. Dulles is also going to want to put more focus on nuclear and air power as part of his new look on foreign policy. He wanted the United States to instantly know of any Soviet aggression using our full military and nuclear arsenal. This is called massive retaliation. So the way to think about this, like let's pretend that you throw a piece of paper at me, like you crumple up a piece of paper and you throw it at me, and I respond by expelling you from the school. That would be a massive retaliation. And that's what we tell the Soviet Union. If they do anything, no matter how small, we are going to retaliate by essentially wiping the Soviet Union off the map. And that's what we tell them. We're very vocal about telling them this. This is what's going to happen if you mess with us. And because the Soviet Union's in the midst of a power vacuum and a power struggle, and there's no clear leader after Joseph Stalin's dead, they're going to believe us for a while. On top of that, we're also going to continue working on our nuclear arsenal. I may have shown you this picture before, but it is fascinating to me, so I like to keep showing it. Um, we're going to be able to build bigger and more powerful bombs. So when I say that we have bombs that can wipe out humanity, or uh, when we talk about massive retaliation, this is what we are saying. Look at the bottom left. You will notice that that is Hiroshima, that center circled one, and then Trinity's right next to that. And now we have significantly more powerful nuclear bombs, and you can see that the potential for devastation is significantly higher during the 1950s. So even though, again, it's a thaw in the Cold War, it doesn't mean that we're not taking it seriously, because these kinds of weapons exist, and holy cow, what can happen if one of these is actually dropped on a major populated area. The 1950s is also going to be a time period of the growth of the Central Intelligence Agency. The CIA is essentially created, well, it's created earlier than this, but it's basically created as a means of being able to keep up with what's going on in other countries, specifically in foreign countries where we think communism might spread. So the CIA is going to be involved in a lot of actions around the world during this time period. They're going to be involved in numerous revolutions and government overthrows with the goal of toppling Soviet regimes wherever possible. 80% of the CIA's budget went towards covert actions, assassinations, political coups, financially supporting foreign leaders. And the CIA is going to be involved with major problems in Iran, the Philippines, Egypt, Israel, Guatemala, and more. Your textbook at this point is going to talk about a couple of these actions in a little bit of detail. I'll cover one or two that I think are a little bit more important than others. But just know that the United States is basically in the background of almost every major political problem of the 1950s. And a lot of the problems that we have had in the 80s, 90s, and early 2000s are all basically repercussions of what was going on in the 1950s with the actions of the CIA. Okay, so I'm not going to do this story justice. So for all of our Cuban Americans, or all of the people listening to this from Cuba, or all of our great grandparents that lived through this, I apologize for not giving this the significant detail and attention that it deserves. But I'm going to set up a problem that we're going to address in a later chapter. So Cuba's basically been involved in the American story almost from the very beginning. Um, During this time period, Cuba is actually basically controlled by a military dictator named Batista, which is actually a pretty awesome name. He's a military dictator, but the thing is, he's not really liked by his own people. There's basically going to be a bit of a revolution in Cuba in the 1950s, led by this dude named Fidel Castro. By the way, as of this recording, Fidel Castro is still alive. I think he is literally 75,000 years old. I mean, he looks like Abraham or Moses or something. So maybe he is Abraham. Hmm. Anyway, in 1959, Fidel Castro is going to overthrow the Cuban government. And Castro is soon going to nationalize businesses owned by Americans and introduce massive land reforms. Turns out Castro might be a bit of a communist. That's going to be a problem. 80% of all businesses in Cuba were owned by Americans, so we're actually going to see this as a pretty big threat. Eisenhower responds by cutting all diplomatic ties with Cuba. Castro is going to turn to the Soviet Union for help because we're basically going to stop trade with Cuba. And Cuba is now going to fall to communism. And it's going to be a significant issue for us in the coming years. Ooh, here's another story I'm adding to the video lecture that I do not say in class, because it's a little complicated. So, again, for those of you that are fans of Egypt and are fans of canals, uh, and are aware of where the Aswan High Dam is, I apologize ahead of time for not doing this story justice, but I'm going to cover it in brief detail just so that way you know what it was. In 1954, Gamal Abdel Nasser came to power in Egypt, and his plans were to modernize the nation. His main goal was to build a dam at Aswan. The US said that we would help them build this dam so long as Nasser didn't turn the country communist. Unfortunately, Nasser is going to recognize the People's Republic of China, we'll talk about them later, which forces the United States to stop supporting Nasser. Nasser then takes over the Suez Canal, which really Egypt didn't own. And the thing is, the Suez Canal is a major shipping route between the Middle East and Europe. Britain planned to take the canal back by force, and in fact, a little war is going to break out in Egypt over the Suez Canal. Britain, France, and Israel attacked Egypt in 1956. The US went to the United Nations to try to force everyone to stop fighting, fearing that if the West antagonized the Middle East too much, the Middle East would turn to communism and basically take all of their oil with them. So what's the conclusions of all of this? Well, first, there's going to be a lot of anti-Western opinions in the Middle East. The Middle East is going to have a anti-Western opinion because of this and other conflicts that we have with them. And really, on top of that, the United States is going to issue something called the Eisenhower Doctrine, which states that the United States would send military aid to the Middle East if they were threatened by communist aggression. So again, our goal is to keep the Middle East and their oil friendly to the United States. The most significant actions of the CIA during the 1950s are actually going to take place in Vietnam. At the time, France was occupying and protecting the region with financial and military support from the United States. The French were losing control of their colonies despite our help, and there's basically going to be a threat of power vacuums in East Asia, Southeast Asia. At the Geneva Convention of 1954, France is going to give up all of its colonies in Indochina, what is today known as Vietnam, Cambodia, and Laos. Vietnam is going to be split in half at the 17th parallel, pending future elections in 1956. There's going to be a communist party led by Ho Chi Minh, and there's going to be a nationalist party led by Ngo Dien Dien. I apologize for not pronouncing that correct. Essentially, what happens here is that there's going to be an election about what Vietnam should be. Should it be a capitalist country or a communist country? Diem is going to refuse to allow democratic elections and takes over control of the government. The United States is going to support Diem, not because he's a good guy, but I mean, really, he's kind of a dictator. But we're not going to support him because he's a good guy. We're just going to support him because he's not a communist. And this is going to be a common theme for the United States. We're going to support a guy, no matter how bad he is, we're going to support people simply because they aren't communist. Regardless of any of their other policies, if you're not a communist, we're going to be your friend during this time period. The US supports the Diem as they are afraid that all of Asia is going to fall to communism like a series of dominoes. Again, this is known as the domino theory, this idea that if one country falls to communism, other ones are going to follow. The CIA's actions in Vietnam and other regions are going to lead to future problems for the US in the coming years and decades. The idea was to limit the spread of communism, but in many cases the actions of the United States just makes capitalism and democracy look worse in the eyes of the people that are affected by our actions. As Eisenhower is leaving office, he is going to give a warning to the United States. And it's a warning that we don't really listen to. Even though Eisenhower is a military general, he said uh, that while he was happy that he avoided war, war is going to be inevitable in some parts of the country. And he warns the country of something called the military industrial complex, saying that the buildup of the military with defense contracts um, and so many Americans employed in making weapons, the fact is that this industry has gotten so large that it's going to encourage the country to fight in wars and do other actions involving the military that are not in the United States' best interest, simply because it would allow these businesses to stay open. So if you have a business making warheads, it is in your business's best interest to make sure America is blowing up other countries. This is something that Eisenhower was afraid was happening, and it turns out it's actually something that did happen. This picture here on the left kind of explains how this whole thing goes down, but essentially, if there are big major corporations who make money building weapons, those corporations are going to influence America and encourage America to go to wars that maybe we really shouldn't be involved in. So many Americans might die, it's going to be very expensive to go to these wars, but they're going to exist for the sole purpose of making sure those businesses stay open. That's the military industrial complex, and it really is something that does happen and does influence American foreign policy today. A bunch of unelected officials who own businesses are influencing politicians to go to war so they can keep making money. If you want to see this done in a movie form, go ahead and watch the first Iron Man film. That's essentially one of the things it's trying to address. The Cold War is more than just a war involving guns and weapons and warheads. The Cold War is also about culture and prestige and which country can do the best and greatest things. It's not just we can build the biggest weapon, it also implies we have the best culture, we have the best science, we have the best everything in our country. So during the 1950s, the Cold War kind of changes focus and becomes a cultural war on top of a military buildup war. And unfortunately for the United States, this is something that we actually, at first, are losing. The goal was to conquer the only area not yet under communist or capitalist control, space. On October 4th, 1957, the Russians are going to launch Sputnik, which is the first satellite launched into space. The US was caught off guard, having not planned anything or any type of a space program, and yet we had to start a race to catch up to the Soviet Union. Americans were shocked that we were behind the Soviets technologically, and the Soviets had planned to do something that wasn't even on our radar at this time period. Russia begins to send dogs into space, with humans not far behind. In response, Eisenhower sets up the National Aeronautics and Space Administration, or NASA, in July of 1958. The eventual goal is the moon. Now look, I'm a huge NASA fan, but see, this kind of makes me laugh. We call this the space race, but really the United States already lost. In fact, the Soviet Union had finished the had finished the race before the United States even realized there was a race. And then once the U.S. joins, we say, okay, okay, that was cool. Thank you for starting the whole space thing. But now that we're playing the game, let's make the goal even further away. So like we call this the space race, but technically we already lost. So all we did was just change the terms of the race. Let's make the eventual goal the moon. And in fact, that is going to be part of what we call the technological war. The United States is going to spend a lot, and I mean a lot of money on science and math education during this time period. Um, we're going to open up all of these new advances in science and technology. Um, if you are a science teacher or a math teacher during this time period, you're one of the most important Americans. In fact, my grandfather is going to work for NASA building space shuttles because, again, our goal is to get to the moon and our goal is to get into space and our goal is to look outside of just ourselves. And that's going to come from this time period. It's part of the cultural and scientific aspect of the Cold War that is usually not often discussed. We're always aware of the fact that there was a military buildup, but there's actually a culture buildup during this time period as well. Okay, Mullen, you said at the start of this chapter that this was the greatest time to be a 25-year-old male in this country. How on earth is that possible? What are you talking about? Well, the 1950s are a time period that we call the Affluent Society, which is a fancy way of saying that uh, we got a pretty darn good economy and a pretty darn good culture in the United States during this time period. The United States was already the most powerful nation in the world after World War II, and during the 1950s, the United States is going to become the richest country in the world as well. The United States had achieved the highest standard of living in the world. 60% of Americans own homes, 75% of Americans own cars, and 87% of Americans own TVs. The average American family income is going to triple during the 1950s. Remember how we talked about the 1920s as the roaring 20s and people are making money and everyone's happy? Yeah, the 1950s is going to drastically surpass the wealth of the 1920s. The gross national product rose 50% in this decade. The United States at this time period had 6% of the world's total population, but half of everything bought or sold in the entire world was made or consumed by the United States. 6% of the world's population, but we're basically involved in half of the world's consumption and half of the world's purchasing. Like, that is crazy, but that shows the wealth of this time period. Um, and it's going to reflect in our culture. The government's going to keep spending money during the 1950s as well. The idea of deficit spending, that idea that we're going to bill our grandchildren for things that we want now, that's going to continue during this time period. But we're going to use this as a means of ensuring prosperity for American workers and to pay for defense and research programs. Money is going to be continually funded towards the West Coast with more and more government facilities, especially defense-based, based on the West Coast, because, we are closer to Russia. In fact, if you live in Alaska, you can see Russia from your house. Side note, you can't see Russia from Alaska. I went to Alaska. I went to Sarah Palin's house. I know this is kind of strange, but she lives right off a freeway. I went to Alaska. I went to Sarah Palin's house, and you can't see Russia. In fact, you can't see much of anything. Side note about Alaska that most people don't realize, they have lots of tall trees there. So you really can't see very far at all unless you're at the top of a hill. Sorry. Anyway, um, the U.S. was consuming as never before, leading to new industries to grow. Farmers essentially disappear in this country as the country focuses on electronics, chemical engineering, and defense contracts. Oh, here's a picture of Disneyland because I wanted to show a picture of Disneyland. It also represents the 1950s. However, while the average American lives got better, the rich also got considerably richer during this time period. Like before, as we discussed during the 1920s, big businesses began to take over smaller ones. For example, during this time period, we go from having dozens of car makers and dozens of television networks, and we cut it down to only being 3 automakers and 3 television networks. Businesses also begin to take over companies overseas to become multinational corporations. The idea that their country is going to be working in country, or sorry, their business is going to be working in countries all over the world. Businesses also begin to take over unrelated industries and become conglomerates. For example, a telephone company could take over a car rental service, or Walt Disney could own ESPN, or Time Warner can own People magazine, something like that. They're not directly related companies, but that's essentially what's going to happen here. Or the fact that the same company that makes cigarettes also makes veggie burgers. See, like that's what a conglomerate is. It's a corporation that is made up of a bunch of smaller entities and other corporations that aren't always directly related. Kind of weird that the company that makes um, coffee also makes batteries and Old Spice and Iams dog food. Just something to think about. At the same time, labor unions are going to basically disappear during the 1950s. Workers are making more money, they have paid vacations, they have shorter work weeks, and they're getting health care. So Americans are like, well, maybe we don't need labor unions. And remember, there's this inherent thought that labor unions are communist. And remember, because of the Red Scare, we are afraid of and hate communism. I realize I talked about this earlier in the video, but your textbook also brings this up again later in the chapter, so I guess I'll just leave this here. Um, because of the GI Bill, because of the Interstate Highway Act, um, Americans and the government spending more money out west, Americans are going to be moving further and further away from cities, and they're going to be moving westward. Many Americans are going to move to suburbs outside of big cities where it is safer to raise a family and use their cars to drive into work. You guys live in a suburb. 11 million new homes are going to be built in the suburbs in the 1950s, housing roughly 20 million Americans. This is going to drain cities of upper and middle class workers, leading cities to become rundown, poor, and crime ridden, which is going to encourage even more people to leave. We call this concept white flight, this idea that wealthier and normally white Americans are going to want to live in places where it's safer, surrounded by other white Americans. And as minorities move into regions, white Americans leave and they go find another place where they aren't surrounded by minorities. It's actually a pretty continuous problem in American history, and it still exists even today. You guys living in Southern California, we're pretty racially diverse, especially at our school, but other schools tend to not be as racially diverse. And when a school does tend to get to um, racially diverse, usually what ends up happening, if you look at it from a sociological perspective, people start to leave and to flee away. And by people, I mean the more affluent tend to leave as um, non-affluent people in communities start to mix in. That's just kind of what tends to happen. Um, and we really start to see that significantly in the 1950s. Suburbs need to be built quickly. We have to build 11 million houses and we got to do it fast. So, we're going to do it with this process using prefabricated materials. Most of the houses are going to look the exact same and have the exact same amenities. This meant that they could be constructed quickly and cheaply. The most famous of this type of housing is going to be known as a Levittown. You guys can see this picture here on the left. There are four different housing styles, and essentially what they would do is they would build these houses in a row, one, two, three, four, and then they would repeat over again, one, two, three, four. You could have any of these four houses, and what they did is they essentially um, had all of the parts basically made off-site, brought in by truck, and then assembled by a work crew. The story goes that they could actually put together one of these houses in a matter of a couple of days, as opposed to building a house from scratch, which could take months or years. They can build houses really, really fast. The houses are, cheaper because they're mass produced, and that is basically what most Americans are going to be living in. And in fact, I don't know which street it is in our town, but there are a couple of housing districts set up where we are that are essentially set up the exact same way. And in fact, that's actually how most houses are built today for that reason. It's quicker, it's cheaper, and Americans don't like having that many choices. What's the effect of the baby boom? We talked about the baby boom last chapter. What is the effect of it? Now those kids are getting a little bit older. It's been a couple of pages since we talked about them before. So what's the effect of it? Well, the 1950s is going to experience a population explosion in the United States, and not just because of the baby boom. Americans are eating better, working easier jobs, and there's been advancements in medicine. Life expectancy is going to increase 5 years in just the 1950s alone. So Americans are living longer and are being more prosperous, and on top of that, we're also having a lot of kids. Americans are getting married younger and having more children. Their fertility rate is the highest it has ever been in the United States during the 1950s. Because of this, the US population increases 19% during this era. And by 1960, 1/3 of the United States population is under the age of 14. That's the effect of the baby boom. That's crazy. This is going to have a drastic effect on society. In the 1940s, we built a lot of elementary schools. In the 1950s, we built a lot of middle schools and high schools. In the 1960s, we built a lot of colleges. And in the 1970s, the children of the baby boomers get married, move into houses, and have kids. In fact, we're also going to do this thing like, for example, if you're a fan of Disneyland, which we live by, Disneyland is actually an effect of the baby boom. If there is no baby boom, there is no Disneyland. Disneyland is created as a place where families can spend time together, and people of all ages can enjoy different attractions with their family. So this is essentially going to be created as a place where families can spend time together. If there is no baby boom in America, there is no Disneyland. How different would your world be without Disney controlling everything? In fact, I think Disney owns this video. Maybe. There's also going to be a big concern during this time period of how should you properly raise a child? Dr. Benjamin Spock of Star Trek fame, not really, is going to reinforce the importance of motherhood. The implication being that mothers should not work outside the home. Crying babies should be immediately soothed, breastfeeding was vital, and spanking was not allowed. Because of this, this is going to influence uh, or re-influence female gender roles being in the home. We're going to have a return to domesticity during this time period. Popular culture is going to glorify this concept of motherhood and set the role of a male as working and the woman as being a submissive partner in control of the home. Women were supposed to cater to the comforts of men, not complain about anything the male does, never question a male, and to know her place. I'll show you guys an article about this in class. That was from a popular magazine during this time period. It sounds just like the cult of domesticity. It sounds just like Republican motherhood because that's what it is. After the war, women are going to be encouraged to stay at home and to raise the family. Now, this is not to say that women are worthless. It's more of a we realize that children are important and women being at home is a really good way to ensure a proper childhood. Um, that's essentially going to be the logic of this time period. The high school and college dropout rates among women are going to spike because many women are encouraged to not miss the boat on a husband by getting a higher education. So the culture is going to say, women, you are going to be wasting your life if you don't get married early. If you wait too long to get married and wait too long to have kids, you're never going to, and your worth as a human being is less. If you guys want to see this typified of what the 1950s looks like, I want you to watch the TV show I Love Lucy. Find an episode, maybe I'll try to link one in the description down below. Find an episode, and if you watch any episode of I Love Lucy, you'll notice something. Lucy, who is the stereotypical 1950s woman, um, even though she breaks a lot of gender roles and is a comedian and has her own TV show, blah, blah, blah. But she is representing the stereotypical 1950s woman. You'll notice that if you ever watch the show, every single time Lucy is outside of the house trying to work a job, she screws up. She makes a mistake. She is basically inept outside of the home, right? But on the flip side, inside of the home, she does everything right. She doesn't make any mistakes. And her husband, Ricky, makes a whole bunch of mistakes by because he's not supposed to be in the home. So inside the home, Lucy is the character that is always doing the right thing. Outside the home, Lucy is the character that is always failing. This is representing how women were thought of during this time period. Your role is in the home, not outside of the home, and that's going to be pretty important for the cultural norms of this time period. Sorry, I know I usually have a picture, but I just realized that I accidentally deleted this slide, so I'm going to throw it in here really quickly to make sure that we don't forget about it. Not everyone during this era is going to buy into the 1950s culture and the growth of the middle class. A movement of intellectuals known as beats are going to challenge the conformity of the 1950s. Artists began to challenge the conformity by painting or writing odd things or stories with anti heroes. Perhaps you've heard of a band that does this. They're known as the Beatles. Oh, now I get it. This movement is going to use a lot of drugs and practice open sexuality in stark contrast to the television and popular media of this time period, which is like super conservative. On top of that, a feminist movement is going to re-spark in this country in the 1950s, led by a woman named Betty Friedan. Betty Friedan writes a book called The Feminine Mystique, which informed women of the wonders outside the home and told women that they could pursue a life of their own and still achieve happiness. Okay, so now your textbook is going to completely take a left turn. It's been talking about the culture of the 1950s for a long time. Now it's going to take a huge divergence from that and start talking about the civil rights movement. And it's going to bridge that into the next chapter. So, what I want you guys to do, and what's probably a good idea for you, stand up, walk around, take a 5 minute break because we're going to come back and talk about something completely different. So go ahead and pause this video. I promise nothing interesting will happen. Um, although you're pausing the video, so I guess that statement doesn't make any sense. But yeah, seriously, pause this video, go relax for a minute, go stand up and walk around because we're going to talk about something completely different. Go ahead and hit pause right now. Okay, welcome back. So let's tell the story of the origins of the civil rights movement. But first, let's recap the previous, I don't know, 100 years of this class. The 13th and 14th Amendments come after the American Civil War. And because of them, whites and blacks are going to be seen as equals according to the Constitution. The 13th Amendment, of course, ended slavery. The 14th defined citizenship. And the 15th Amendment is going to call for universal male suffrage, regardless of race, religion, or previous condition of servitude. However, many states are not going to respect the equality of white and black Americans and instead are going to pass segregation laws that keep white and black men separated. We're going to pass some Jim Crow laws, which are laws that required whites and blacks to attend different schools, hospitals, and even required blacks to be buried in different cemeteries than whites. Congress had no authority to limit discrimination in private industry during this time period. And of course, there's also going to be the Plessy versus Ferguson case, which is basically going to say that segregation is permissible so long as all facilities are separate but equal. Yeah, that's a recap of everything that we've talked about. Okay, well, let's move on to the next slide and we'll see how this is all going to be challenged and changed. Now, in 1909, W.E.B. Du Bois is going to set up the NAACP, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. And of course, this group is going to be created to legally challenge segregation. You guys don't remember this, but a couple of weeks ago I mentioned that, and then I said, okay, we're going to hit the pause button on the story of black rights, and we're going to get back to it. Now, 5 chapters later, we're getting back to that story. But what was the NAACP doing the entire time? Well, the, during the 1920s, the 30s, and the 40s, and the 50s, the NAACP is going to be challenging segregation laws one by one, and slowly but surely proving the legal equality of whites and blacks. Thurgood Marshall is going to become the NAACP's most important legal activist during this time period. His plan was to legally overturn Plessy versus Ferguson, but to do it, he faced 2 big problems. First, Plessy versus Ferguson established something called a legal precedent. So, what a legal precedent means is that future law cases have to refer to previous law cases to make a ruling. So, the idea being that once something's been decided by a judge, it has to be decided a similar way in a similar case. So, because the Supreme Court, the top law in the land, has said that segregation is legal so long as facilities are separate but equal, Thurgood Marshall is going to have to try really hard to find a way to break that established precedent. How are we going to change that mindset? Basically, we are looking for a case that is so obviously wrong and a case of separate but equal being applied so inaccurately that it's going to cause the government and cause the court system to change the legal precedent. By the way, want to know why lawyers have to read so many books, and every time you see a picture of a lawyer, like you see here, you see all those books behind them? Those books are all lists of legal precedents. Those are all cases that have already been decided that might be similar to the one you're arguing. What lawyers spend most of their time doing is reading those books to see how a case might be similar to the one they are arguing. Then they go up to a judge and say, hey, yo, in the case of blah versus blah, this is how you ruled. So in the case that you're listening to today, you have to do the same thing. That's what lawyers do. So anyway, back to the story. Next, segregation is going to exist in all areas of life, which means that each one of these areas is going to have to be separately challenged to break the precedent. This is going to be a very long, very arduous process. It's going to take John Marshall himself over 20 years of arguing cases to slowly but surely crack away at the separate but equal doctrine. He does have considerable success, but what we need is a really big case that is so obviously wrong that many Americans are going to agree with it. Here is the story. Sometimes this case is referred to as Brown v. Board, and the test, or people tend to neglect the fact that this took place in the American South, in Topeka, Kansas. But I always like to make sure to remind students that this specific case did happen in a specific area of the country. Sometimes I think the South tries to absolve themselves of this, but they really shouldn't. So I try to be very adamant in saying that most of these movements that we're going to be talking about and most of these events are going to take place in the American South. Anyway, in 1953, Eisenhower is going to nominate a new judge to the Supreme Court, Chief Justice Earl Warren. While on the bench, as we call it, Warren is going to hear and make some of the most controversial decisions in the history of the Supreme Court. None is more famous or more controversial than the case of Brown versus the Board of Education. Here's the problem. Story goes that a 10-year-old black girl had to attend school 10 miles away when there was a equally appropriate white school that was 4 blocks away from her house. The question is this separate but equal? Is it, um, is this black girl having an equal opportunity to education when she has to walk 10 miles by herself through dangerous streets to get to a school when there is a just as appropriate school right next to her house that's only meant for white people? There's also a bigger implication here that the facilities that have been set up for white and black students were not equal, and there were nowhere near as many facilities set up for black students as there were for white students. That's the bigger implication here. The Supreme Court's going to say, no, this is not separate but equal, and this happens with a unanimous vote. Uh, Chief Justice Earl Warren says that in the field of public education, separate but equal has no place. Now, we're going to read his actual opinions in class, so there's a document that goes and ties in with this discussion that we'll cover in more detail later. So don't worry, I'm just going to recap it here, but in class we've done a lot more on this. Brown versus the board had huge implications. Because the government basically just said that separate but equal has no place, essentially this Supreme Court case is going to end and overturn Plessy versus Ferguson. That's a huge change. We've now changed the legal precedent in this country. Brown versus the board meant that schools needed to be integrated or mixed. However, this process is going to be a very slow process that's deliberately held back by whites. 12 million students across the country were affected by this ruling, and the ruling spread to other areas of life, including housing, beaches, restaurants, theaters, restrooms, etc. The civil rights movement now had reached the entire nation. 80% of white Southerners opposed this decision, and Southern state legislatures began writing and changing laws that further hold back black Americans. In 1956, 100 members of Congress signed something called the Southern Manifesto, which declared the Brown ruling null and void. By the end of 1956, not a single school in the South was integrated. Now, we got to change this, and that's going to be the story of the rest of this chapter. How does the black community, how does the civil rights movement basically force the country, specifically the South, to integrate? How do we end segregation? How do black Americans fight for their equality? Well, let's tell the start of that story. In 1957, Arkansas Governor Orville Faubus resisted the integration of Central High School in Arkansas. 9 black students were going to enroll in the school and face thousands of protesters on the first day. In fact, Governor Faubus sent in the Arkansas National Guard to block the entrance to the school to not allow these black students to attend. And again, legally, this school has to be integrated. President Eisenhower is going to warn Faubus that he must comply with the Supreme Court or face the consequences. Eisenhower does not want to start a fight over civil rights, let alone potentially a civil war again, but his duty as the president is clear. His job is to enforce the laws, and the Supreme Court just said all schools must be integrated. The protests are going to continue, leading Eisenhower to bring in 10,000 National Guardsmen and 1,000 paratroopers to escort 9 students to class. You want to see if there's any discipline issues that day on campus? 10,000 soldiers with guns are there to make sure 9 students can go to school. Yeah, I'm going to go ahead and argue that that was a pretty safe day on campus. There might not have been a lot of tardies. And you guys get nervous when we do a tardy sweep here on campus. Anyway, take a look at this picture here on the right. This picture is a famous picture from this time period. This black girl here in the front is one of the members of the Little Rock Nine. And what you will see, look at the hatred on the face of the white female students behind her. The abject racism and hatred of this time period. And this is going to be another thing about the civil rights movement. We have a lot of pictures and a lot of media from this time period showing the racism and hatred. You'll notice that this black student is doing nothing wrong. She is going to school. She is well kept. She's obvious, the implication is that she is a studious student doing nothing wrong, and here she is being harassed and intimidated by a crowd of people for no reason. All she's doing is being a good student. Yet, she's going to be harassed and mistreated. When you guys see this picture, I hope that you get the response of, what the hell is wrong with those girls in the background? Because that's the opinion that the civil rights movement is hoping you'll have. That way, people start to change their mind about what's going on and this whole concept of segregation. Maybe segregation is a really bad idea. Once you see it in a picture like this, the average American slowly starts to change their mind about it. And that's going to be a theme of the civil rights movement as we discuss the next several events during this time period. Anyway, once the National Guardsmen leave, because eventually the school just reluctantly accepts the fact that black and white students are going to be attending here, students face continual persecution from white students for the remainder of the year, but these 9 did finish out the school year. Well, 8 of the 9. One of the girls is going to be expelled. I'll tell you the story in class. Anyway, um, after this, uh, after this event, Governor Favis is going to shut down the entire school district for 2 years. Basically, he's so resistant to integration that he's going to shut down the entire school system for 2 years, um, until the government basically forces the federal government forces these schools to open again. What's crazy is that racist governor, Governor Favis, is going to stay in power and continually be reelected until 1967. It's kind of a sad story, but it's true. And this is actually going to be the start of the change of the civil rights movement. The civil rights movement is going to go from a movement based off of legal actions, which is what it has been doing since 1909. And then in the 1950s, we're going to start to see a change, and we're going to see a change in the civil rights movement to civil disobedience. The idea here is to use the media to gain national attention, and by doing this, laws are going to slowly change. You guys, at least the group of students that I've recently taught, have seen something similar happen when it comes to gay rights. It's the same logic. There is the legal battle, and then there has to be a cultural battle. Well, at this time period, black Americans had legally just won Brown versus the Board of Education, which ends segregation. But now they have to change the people's minds in the country, and that's going to be a lot harder. One of the famous places to start this story is with the Montgomery Bus Boycott. In Montgomery, Alabama, blacks and whites had to sit in separate sections of the bus, and the bus is going to be a very common used thing at this time period. Additionally, if all white seats were taken, blacks were required to stand at the back of the bus. Rosa Parks, who was an NAACP activist and who was trained in nonviolent resistance, refuses to move when a white man boards a crowded bus. Now, by the way, she is not the first um, member of the NAACP to do this, and she had trained to do this. This was a planned protest on her aspect. The idea that she was just tired that day and she was just some random woman, that's actually not true. This was a planned event. She was just waiting for the right moment, and she was chosen to do it because she was a woman who had basically a clear record. There was nothing anyone bad could say about her because she had nothing bad in her past. So that's why she is the one that is chosen to be the person involved in this, to start this boycott. Anyway, she's going to be arrested for refusing to stand up, and she is thrown in jail for over 2.5 hours. The NAACP responds by planning a boycott of all of the buses. And this is going to be a huge financial fight because black Americans make up 75% of all bus passengers in Montgomery. In fact, I believe the story goes that within a couple of weeks, the bus system in Montgomery, Alabama basically goes bankrupt. The idea here is black Americans are going to use their wallets to force integration. So fine, we're going to use our wallets and we're going to basically not give any money to the white community until they realize that their laws are racist and wrong. The laws were not changed, so the boycott dragged on. Blacks created carpools for 30,000 people daily, and this boycott's going to last over 381 days, even though the bus system nearly goes bankrupt after the first 2 weeks. Eventually, the Supreme Court demanded an end to segregated buses. The Montgomery Bus Boycott is also going to be assisted and organized by a group of by a young up-and-coming pastor named Martin Luther King Jr. MLK was a 26-year-old minister with a PhD in theology. His powerful speaking style and strong convictions would convince millions to join the movement. King's beliefs will define the civil rights movement. There's two major components: nonviolent resistance and civil disobedience. The black community is going to do nothing wrong. If they get punched, then they're going to get punched. They're not going to respond. The black community is not going to respond violently. Everything they do in this movement is going to be peaceful. And the idea is to show other groups not treating them well for no real reason and not being antagonized. Another big part of the black rights movement is going to be religion, specifically in Dr. King's case of Christianity. The idea is to denounce injustice and approach enemies with love. I'll leave you guys and I'll end this chapter with one of my favorite quotes by Dr. King, and it's going to kind of exemplify what the end of this chapter and the start of the next chapter is about. This idea of fighting for equality. If we are wrong, the Constitution is wrong. If we are wrong, God Almighty is wrong. If we are wrong, Jesus of Nazareth was merely a utopian dreamer and never came down to earth. If we are wrong, justice is a lie. I will leave you with that, and I will see all of you guys and continue the civil rights movement in the next chapter. Have fun doing your homework, kids.